Corporal Otto Becker had survived the brutal winters of the Eastern Front, endured Allied bombing raids that turned German cities to rubble, and watched his comrades fall one by one in the dying days of the Third Reich. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the moment when an American guard handed him a strange, dark bottle filled with bubbling liquid that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his captors. What started as mockery of what he called a child soda would soon become an obsession that revealed the true power of America, a power that had nothing to do with tanks or bombs but everything to do with abundance. By the end of his captivity, Otto would write letters home describing how this simple drink had shown him something about American industrial might that all the propaganda in the world couldn't hide. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly on the sandy soil of Camp Gordon as Otto Becker adjusted his faded gray uniform and squinted through the chain-link fence at the American landscape beyond. The year was 1945, and the war that had consumed his youth was finally over, leaving him and thousands of other German prisoners of war stranded in a foreign land that seemed as alien to him as the surface of Mars. The camp stretched for miles, filled with identical wooden barracks that housed former soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the Kriegsmarine, all now reduced to the same humble status of defeated enemies learning to navigate their strange new reality. Otto had been 22 when he was captured near the Rhine, his unit decimated by American artillery that seemed to rain down from the heavens with supernatural precision. He remembered the moment clearly, the white flag raised by his commanding officer, the sudden silence that followed weeks of constant bombardment, and the almost surreal calm that settled over the battlefield like morning Chevrolet mist. The Americans who took him prisoner had been surprisingly professional, even kind, offering him water and medical attention for the shrapnel wound in his shoulder. This kindness had puzzled him then, and it puzzled him still as he worked alongside other prisoners, clearing brush and building roads under the supervision of guards who treated them more like wayward students than dangerous, enemies. The work was hard, but not unbearable, especially compared to the hellish conditions he had endured during the final months of the war, when food was scarce and ammunition even scarcer. Here in Georgia, they were fed regularly, given clean clothes, and allowed to write letters home, though Otto had no idea if his family in Bavaria was even alive to receive them. The American Red Cross had established procedures for prisoner welfare that seemed almost absurdly generous to men who had grown accustomed to the harsh realities of total war. They were provided with books, allowed to form small orchestras and theater groups, and even given access to American newspapers, though most of the prisoners could barely read enough English to understand the headlines. It was during his third week at the camp that Otto first encountered the mysterious brown liquid that would change his perspective on everything he thought he knew about American society. He had been working with a crew of 12 other prisoners, digging drainage ditches near the camp's main administrative building. When Sergeant Jake Rodriguez approached their work detail carrying a wooden crate filled with bottles that caught the afternoon sunlight like dark amber gems. Rodriguez was one of the more popular guards among the prisoners. A stocky man from New Mexico who spoke a little German he had learned from his grandmother, and who often shared stories about his own immigrant family's struggles during the Great Depression. "All right, boys," Rodriguez called out in his accented English, setting the crate down near the worksite. "Command says you fellas have been working hard in this heat, so they're trying something new. These here are Coca-Colas, straight from Atlanta. Each man gets one bottle, but you gotta drink it here and give me back the sigh. Bottle when you're done. N." Otto watched with curiosity as Rodriguez used a metal opener to remove the caps from the bottles, releasing a soft hissing sound that reminded him somehow of the steam engines he had loved as a child. The liquid inside was dark brown, almost black, and bubbled vigorously as though it were alive. When Rodriguez handed him a bottle, Otto held it up to the light, marveling at the way the carbonation created tiny streams of bubbles that raced toward the surface like miniature fireworks. The bottle itself was beautifully shaped, with elegant curves that felt perfect in his calloused hands, and embossed with a script logo that read Coca-Cola in flowing letters that somehow seemed quintessentially American. "Was this das?" asked Hans Mueller, a former tank commander from Prussia who was standing next to Otto. Hans had been one of the most vocal critics of American culture since their arrival, constantly complaining about what he perceived as the shallow materialism and lack of proper military discipline among their captors. Otto sniffed the liquid cautiously, detecting a sweet, complex aroma that was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It reminded him vaguely of the medicinal tonics his mother had given him as a child when he was sick, but with an underlying sweetness that was far more appealing. The other prisoners were examining their bottles with similar curiosity and suspicion, turning them in their hands, like archaeologists studying ancient artifacts from a lost civilization. "It smells like medicine," declared Friedrich Weber, a Luftwaffe pilot from Heidelberg who had been shot down over France and had spent 6 months in various American prison camps before arriving at Gordon. Friedrich had developed a reputation as something of an intellectual among the prisoners, often leading discussions about philosophy and literature during their evening recreation periods. Otto took a tentative sip and immediately felt the carbonation attack his tongue with a sensation that was both shocking and delightful. The taste was complex, sweet, but with bitter undertones that seemed to change as the liquid moved across his palate. It was refreshing in a way that water simply wasn't, cutting through the dust and heat that had settled in his throat after hours of manual labor. But more than the taste, it was the entire experience that struck him as profoundly foreign. The combination of the distinctive bottle, the aggressive carbonation, and the bold sweetness that seemed to announce itself as something uniquely American. Kinder soda. Otto laughed, using the German word for children's soda as he took another sip. Several of the other prisoners chuckled at his description, though Otto noticed that none of them seemed particularly eager to stop drinking their bottles. "This is what the Americans give to their children, I think. Very sweet, very, how do you say, artificial." But even as he mocked the drink, Otto found himself taking longer and longer sips, savoring the way the cold liquid seemed to cut through the oppressive Georgia heat. The sweetness was initially overwhelming to his European palate. Accustomed as he was to the more subtle flavors of German beers and wines, but there was something addictive about the combination of sugar, caffeine, and carbonation that his body seemed to crave almost immediately. By the time he had finished half the bottle, he was already wondering when he might be able to have another one. Hans Müller, meanwhile, had drained his entire bottle in 3 enormous gulps and was now staring at the empty container with an expression of profound confusion. "It is too sweet," he declared, though his tone lacked conviction. "German beverages have more sophistication, more tradition. This is just sugar water with bubbles." Friedrich Weber nodded in agreement, though Otto noticed that he was taking very small, careful sips, as though trying to make his bottle last as long as possible. "It represents everything wrong with American culture," Friedrich proclaimed with the authority of someone who had given the matter serious thought. "Instant gratification, artificial flavoring, mass production instead of craftsmanship. In Germany, we take time to brew proper beer, to age wine correctly. This is just industrial chemistry masquerading as refreshment." Despite their intellectual criticism, Otto observed that every single prisoner in the work detail had finished his bottle within 15 minutes, and several were now eyeing the empty crate with what could only be described as longing. Rodriguez collected the empty bottles with a knowing smile, clearly familiar with this particular reaction from previous groups of prisoners. "You boys sure seem to hate that American sugar water," he commented in his broken German, earning nervous laughter from the work crew. That evening, as the prisoners gathered in the recreation hall for their usual discussions and card games, the conversation inevitably turned to their encounter with Coca-Cola. Otto found himself defending the drink against the continued criticism of Hans and Friedrich, though he wasn't entirely sure why he felt compelled to do so. There was something about the beverage that had captured his imagination, something beyond just its taste or its cooling properties. "Think about what we saw today," Otto said, as they sat around a rough wooden table, playing cards with a deck that had been provided by the American Red Cross. "That drink, it came from Atlanta, which is hundreds of kilometers from here, but Rodriguez said they make it exactly the same everywhere. Do you understand what that means?" Hans shrugged dismissively. "It means they have no appreciation for regional differences, for local character. Everything must be the same, standardized, without soul. But Otto shook his head, his mind working through the implications of what he had witnessed. No, Hans, you're missing the point. Think about the logistics required to make that possible. They have to transport ingredients across vast distances, maintain consistent quality control, distribute millions of bottles to every corner of the country. The coordination required, the industrial capacity, the transportation networks. He paused, searching for the right words. It's like a military operation, but for civilians, for pleasure. Friedrich leaned back in his chair, studying Otto with renewed interest. You think this children's soda represents American military power? Not military power exactly, Otto replied, taking a long moment to organize his thoughts. But industrial power, organizational capability, the ability to produce abundance instead of just necessity. During the war, we were always running short of everything: ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies. But these Americans, they can produce luxury drinks in quantities so vast that they can give them away to prisoners. What does that tell you about their manufacturing capacity? The question hung in the air as the three men contemplated its implications. Otto had articulated something that had been nagging at all of them since their arrival at the camp. A growing awareness that they had been fighting an enemy whose true strength lay not just in superior numbers or better equipment, but in an economic system capable of producing abundance on an almost unimaginable scale. The American guards ate white bread every day, wore uniforms that were replaced regularly, and seemed to take for granted luxuries that German civilians hadn't seen in years. Over the following days, Otto found himself thinking about Coca-Cola with an intensity that surprised him. He had expected novelty to wear off quickly, but instead, his curiosity about the drink only deepened as he learned more about its production and distribution during their evening English lessons. Taught by a sympathetic chaplain who believed that language skills would help the prisoners reintegrate into society after their eventual release, Otto peppered the instructor with questions about American manufacturing and marketing. He learned that Coca-Cola had been invented in Atlanta in 1886 by a pharmacist named John Pemberton, originally marketed as a patent medicine that claimed to cure various ailments. The drink had evolved over the decades into something far more ambitious: a global brand that was consumed in virtually every American town and city. The company had developed sophisticated advertising campaigns that associated the product with happiness, refreshment, and the American way of life. During the war, Coca-Cola executives had made a commitment to ensure that American servicemen could get a 5-cent Coke wherever they were stationed around the world, leading to the construction of bottling plants near military bases from the Pacific Islands to North Africa. This last piece of information struck Otto as particularly significant. While German forces had been struggling with supply lines that stretched across hostile territory, often unable to provide basic necessities to frontline troops, the Americans had been establishing facilities to manufacture and distribute a luxury beverage to their soldiers. It was a demonstration of logistical supremacy that went far beyond mere military tactics, representing a fundamental difference in how the two societies approached the relationship between war and civilian life. The next time Sergeant Rodriguez distributed Coca-Colas to the work detail, Otto approached the experience with a more analytical mindset, paying attention not just to the taste, but to every aspect of the product and its presentation. He noticed the precision of the bottling, the consistency of the carbonation level, the uniform sweetness that suggested careful quality control. The label was applied perfectly straight, the bottle cap was securely fastened, and the glass itself was thick enough to protect the contents while remaining lightweight enough for efficient shipping. "Rodriguez," Otto called out in his improving English as the sergeant prepared to collect the empty bottles. "This Coca-Cola, how many factories make it in America?" Rodriguez scratched his head, clearly not having expected such a detailed question. "Hell, I don't know exactly, Otto. Probably dozens, maybe hundreds. They got plants all over the country, plus they're building new ones overseas now that the war's over. My brother-in-law worked at one in California before he got drafted. Said they could bottle thousands of cases in a single day. Thousands of cases in a single day. From just one factory among hundreds." Otto did the mental arithmetic. and felt a strange mixture of awe and dismay as he contemplated the numbers. While Germany had been mobilizing every available resource for total war, diverting food production to support the military and rationing sugar to the point where civilians went months without tasting anything sweet. America had been producing soft drinks on an industrial scale that dwarfed the output of entire German manufacturing sectors. That evening, Otto began writing a letter to his family. Assuming they were still alive and able to receive correspondence from American prison camps. He had written several letters since his capture, mostly focusing on his health and his hope for eventual repatriation. But this letter felt different, more urgent somehow. He wanted to try to explain what he was learning about American society, though he suspected that his observations would sound almost fantastical to readers who had spent the war years dealing with constant shortages and rationing. "Dear family," he began, writing carefully in the neat script he had learned in school before the war changed everything. "I hope this letter finds you safe, and that our beautiful Bavaria is recovering from the destruction of Urla. These past years, I write to you from Georgia, in the American South, where I am being held with many other German soldiers, in conditions that continue to surprise me with their comfort and dignity." He paused, considering how to explain his growing fascination with what might seem like a trivial subject. "I must tell you about something I have discovered here. Something that has made me think differently about the country we were fighting, and why our defeat was perhaps inevitable from the beginning. The Americans have a drink called Coca-Cola, a sweet, carbonated beverage that is consumed throughout their society in quantities that would seem impossible to anyone who lived through our wartime rationing." Otto spent several paragraphs describing the drink itself, its taste and appearance, and the industrial processes required for its production and distribution. But as he wrote, he realized that what he was really trying to convey was something much more profound than mere curiosity about American consumer goods. "What strikes me most deeply," he continued, "is not the drink itself, but what its existence reveals about American society. They have created an economy capable of producing abundance rather than just necessity, luxury rather than mere survival." He described the coordination required to distribute a consistent product across a continent-sized country, the transportation networks that could deliver identical bottles to remote military bases and urban centers alike, the advertising campaigns that had made the brand recognizable to virtually every American raw citizen. "This is not just commercial success," he wrote. "This is a demonstration of organizational capability that explains how they were able to fight a two-front war while maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded what most Germans enjoyed even before Crass." The conflict began. The letter grew longer as Otto explored the implications of his observations, touching on themes of industrial capacity, social organization, and economic philosophy that he had never considered before his SE capture. "I begin to understand that we were not defeated by superior weapons alone," he wrote, "but by a society that could produce both tanks and soft drinks, both military supplies and consumer luxuries, without choosing between them. We spoke often of German efficiency and organization, but I see now that we confused regimentation with true efficiency, sacrifice with genuine strength." Writing the letter took Otto nearly 3 hours, and by the time he finished, the recreation hall had mostly emptied as other prisoners returned to their barracks for the night. He sealed the letter carefully, knowing that it would be read by American censors before being forwarded to Germany, assuming his family's address still existed and they were alive to receive it. But he felt that he had managed to capture something important, a realization that went beyond his personal experience to touch on larger questions about the nature of power and prosperity in the modern world. The following week brought new revelations about American abundance when Rodriguez announced that the camp administration had decided to expand their experiment with prisoner morale by introducing a rudimentary crass canteen system. Prisoners who demonstrated good behavior and completed their work assignments satisfactorily would be allowed to earn credits that could be spent on various small luxury items, including additional Coca-Cola rations beyond the single bottle distributed during work details. The announcement created a stir of excitement throughout the camp as prisoners began calculating how they might earn enough credits for extra privileges. Otto found himself volunteering for additional work assignments, not because he particularly enjoyed manual labor in the Georgia heat, but because he had developed what could only be described as a craving for the brass, complex, sweet taste of Coca-Cola. The drink had somehow become associated in his mind with the brief moments of pleasure and normalcy that punctuated the monotony of prison camp life. Hans Mueller, despite his continued public criticism of American consumer culture, was equally eager to earn canteen credits, though he claimed his interest was purely intellectual. "I want to study this phenomenon more carefully," he explained to Otto as they worked together repairing a section of camp fencing. "To understand how the Americans use these products to control their population, to create artificial desires that serve the interests of their capitalist system." But Otto noticed that Hans seemed to savor each sip of Coca-Cola with an intensity that contradicted his theoretical disapproval. The drink had a way of cutting through ideological resistance, appealing to something more basic than political philosophy or cultural identity. Even Friedrich Weber, who had initially dismissed Coca-Cola as a symbol of American superficiality, admitted privately to Otto that he looked forward to their Coca-Cola rations with an enthusiasm that embarrassed him. "It's the caffeine," Friedrich explained one evening as they sat outside their barracks, watching the Georgia sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "The stimulant effect helps combat the mental fatigue that comes from this repetitive work and the constant uncertainty about our future. It's a form of self-medication, really. Nothing more than a rational response to our circumstances." Otto nodded politely at Friedrich's rationalization, but he suspected that the appeal of Coca-Cola went deeper than mere caffeine addiction. There was something about the entire experience of drinking it that felt fundamentally American, in a way that he was still struggling to define. The boldness of the flavor, the efficiency of the packaging, the casual assumption that such luxuries should be available to everyone, including enemy prisoners, represented a worldview that was alien to his European sensibilities, yet increasingly attractive to his war-weary soul. As the weeks passed, and Otto accumulated enough credits to purchase additional Coca-Cola rations, he began to notice changes in his own behavior and attitudes that both fascinated and disturbed him. He found himself planning his days around the anticipated pleasure of drinking a cold Coke, working harder and more efficiently in order to earn the credits necessary for extra rations. The drink had become a reward system that motivated him in ways that pure duty or survival instinct never had. More troubling to his sense of identity as a German soldier was his growing appreciation for other aspects of American culture that he encountered through his interactions with guards and civilian administrators. The Americans seemed to approach problems with a pragmatic flexibility that contrasted sharply with the rigid hierarchical thinking that had dominated his military training. When equipment broke down, they improvised repairs using whatever materials were available, rather than waiting for official replacement parts. When regulations proved ineffective, they quietly modified procedures to achieve better results, rather than blindly following orders that no longer made sense. This adaptability extended to their treatment of prisoners, which seemed guided more by practical considerations of maintaining order and morale than by ideological principles of punishment or revenge. Otto gradually realized that his captors viewed the war as a regrettable necessity that was now thankfully over, rather than as a cosmic struggle between incompatible worldviews. They seemed genuinely interested in helping German prisoners prepare for eventual repatriation and reintegration into civilian life, providing educational opportunities and job training that would be valuable in peacetime careers. The Coca-Cola experiment was part of this larger philosophy, an attempt to maintain prisoner morale through small luxuries that cost relatively little but provided disproportionate psychological benefits. Otto began to see the drink as a symbol of American pragmatism, a simple solution to the complex problem of managing large populations of potentially hostile foreigners. Rather than relying primarily on punishment and coercion, the Americans had discovered that modest rewards could be more effective at maintaining discipline and cooperation. One particularly hot afternoon in late July, as Otto was working with a road construction crew several miles from the main camp, he experienced what he would later describe as an epiphany about the relationship between individual freedom and collective prosperity. The crew had been laboring for hours under the brutal Georgian sun, laying gravel and tamping it down to create an access road for military vehicles, when Sergeant Rodriguez arrived with their daily Coca-Cola ration bar. As Otto twisted off the cap and took his first long drink of the ice-cold beverage, he felt a rush of genuine gratitude that caught him off guard. The Coca-Cola wasn't just refreshing. It represented a small but significant gesture of human consideration, an acknowledgement that even prisoners deserved moments of pleasure and comfort. But more than that, it demonstrated the abundance that made such gestures possible, the economic surplus that allowed a society to provide luxuries even to its enemies. "Rodriguez," Otto called out as he finished his bottle and prepared to return it. "I have been thinking about this Coca-Cola business, and I have a question that maybe you can answer." The sergeant approached with his usual friendly smile, collecting empty bottles from the other prisoners. "Sure thing, Otto. What's on your mind?" Otto gestured toward the empty bottle in his hand, trying to find words for the complex thoughts that had been developing over the past months. "In Germany, during the war, we had to choose always between military needs and civilian needs. More tanks meant less food for families. More ammunition meant less medicine for hospitals. Everything was, how do you say, zero-sum game. But here, you fight the biggest war in history and still produce luxury drinks for everyone, including prisoners. How is this possible?" Rodriguez considered the question seriously, setting down his collection crate and wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Well, I'm no economist, Otto, but I think it's about how we organize our society. Instead of having the government control everything from the top down, we let individual companies compete with each other to serve consumer needs. Coca-Cola doesn't make Cokes because some bureaucrat orders them to ball. They make Cokes because people want to buy them. And if they don't make them well, some other company will." The explanation was simple, almost simplistic, but it crystallized something that Otto had been struggling to understand about American society. The abundance he witnessed wasn't just the result of superior natural resources or manufacturing technology. It emerged from a different approach to organizing human effort and creativity. Instead of concentrating all decision-making in centralized bureaucracies, Americans had created systems that allowed millions of individual choices to aggregate into collective outcomes that served both private interests and public welfare. So the same system that makes good Coca-Cola also makes good tanks and airplanes? Otto asked, wanting to confirm his understanding. Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly! The company that made engines for our bombers also makes engines for civilian trucks. The factories that produced military uniforms also make clothes for department stores. Competition keeps everyone working hard to make better products at lower prices, and that benefits everybody, soldiers and civilians alike." That evening, Otto began writing another letter to his family, though this one focused less on describing his daily experiences and more on trying to articulate the profound shift in his understanding of political economy that his captivity had produced. "I have learned something here that I think will be important for Germany's future," he wrote. "The Americans did not defeat us primarily through superior military force, though their equipment was certainly better than ours. By the war's end, they defeated us because they had created a society capable of producing abundance rather than just survival, luxury rather than mere necessity." He spent several pages explaining his theory about the relationship between economic freedom and military strength, using Coca-Cola as his primary example of how market competition could produce outcomes that served both individual desires and collective needs. The same organizational principles that allow them to distribute a consistent soft drink across an entire continent also allow them to coordinate the production and deployment of military equipment on a global scale, he wrote. But because their system rewards innovation and efficiency rather than just obedience to authority, they can adapt quickly to changing circumstances and find creative solutions to unexpected problems. The letter grew into something approaching a manifesto as Otto explored the implications of his observations for Germany's post-war reconstruction. He argued that his country would need to learn from American examples of decentralized decision-making and market-based coordination if it hoped to rebuild and prosper in the peacetime world. "We cannot simply return to the old ways of thinking about politics and economics," he wrote. "The war has shown us that societies based on rigid hierarchy and central planning cannot compete with those that harness individual creativity and voluntary cooperation." As summer turned to autumn and rumors of eventual repatriation began circulating through the camp, Otto found himself approaching the prospect of returning to Germany with mixed feelings. Part of him longed to see his homeland again, to discover whether his family had survived the war, and to participate in whatever rebuilding efforts might be underway. But another part of him had grown attached to the rhythms of American prison camp life, with its sabarine and prey, predictable routines, adequate food, and yes, its regular Coca-Cola rations. More importantly, he worried about whether the lessons he had learned about American society would be relevant or welcome in post-war Germany. Would his countrymen be interested in hearing about the organizational principles behind Coca-Cola's success? Would they be willing to consider that their defeat had been caused not just by superior enemy numbers or resources, but by fundamental differences in how societies could be organized to promote both individual prosperity and collective strength? These concerns were partially resolved when Otto received his first letter from home since his capture. Forwarded through Red Cross channels after months of bureaucratic delays, the letter was from his younger sister Maria, who had somehow tracked him down through prisoner of war registration records. Her news was mixed, containing both tragedy and hope in roughly equal measures. Their parents had survived the war, but had lost their small farm to Allied bombing and were now living with relatives in Munich, working whatever jobs they could find in the devastated post-war economy. His older brother Klaus had been killed fighting on the Eastern Front, though Maria spared him the details of how she had learned of Klaus's fate. But Germany itself was slowly beginning to rebuild, aided by American occupation forces who seemed more interested in restoration than brass revenge. "The Americans bring many strange things," Maria wrote in a passage that made Otto smile with recognition. "They have introduced new foods and drinks that none of us had ever seen before the war. There is something called Coca-Cola that the soldiers drink constantly. It is very sweet and fizzy, and the children are fascinated by it, though most adults find it too strange. They say it will be available in German stores soon, though I cannot imagine why anyone would want to buy such an unusual beverage." The irony of his sister's description struck Otto as both amusing and profound. Here she was, encountering Coca-Cola for the first time in the ruins of defeated Germany, while he had spent months in an American prison camp developing what could only be described as an addiction to the same drink. The beverage that had opened his eyes to American abundance and organizational capability was now arriving in his homeland as part of the occupying forces' cultural influence. Otto immediately began writing a response to Maria's letter, eager to share with her some of the insights he had gained during his captivity. But as he wrote, he realized that his enthusiasm for American consumer culture might be difficult to explain to someone who was dealing with the daily challenges of survival in dull post-war Germany. How could he convey the significance of Coca-Cola's industrial distribution system to someone who was struggling to find adequate food and shelter? Instead, he focused on more practical matters, describing the educational opportunities available to prisoners and the job training programs that were preparing them for PT's civilian careers. He mentioned his improving English language skills and his growing understanding of American business practices, presenting these as potentially valuable assets for Germany's reconstruction efforts. Only in the final paragraphs did he venture to discuss his philosophical revelations about the relationship between economic freedom and social prosperity. "I have learned much here about how the Americans organize their society," he wrote carefully. "They have found ways to combine individual initiative with collective cooperation that produce remarkable results. Perhaps some of these lessons will be useful as Germany rebuilds itself for a peaceful future. I especially think you would be interested in this drink called Coca-Cola, which represents many of the principles that made America strong enough to win the war." The letter was interrupted by an announcement that repatriation procedures would begin within the next few weeks, with prisoners being processed in groups based on their home regions and their demonstrated rehabilitation progress. Otto felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety as he contemplated returning to a Germany that had been transformed by defeat and occupation. He would be leaving behind not just the relative comfort and predictability of prison camp life, but also the daily access to Coca-Cola that had become such an important part of his routine. On his final work detail before processing began, Sergeant Rodriguez approached Otto with a small cardboard box that contained 6 bottles of Coca-Cola, still cold from the camp's refrigeration system. "These are for you, Otto," Rodriguez said with a grin. "Call it a going-away present. I know how much you've come to appreciate the taste of American freedom." Otto was genuinely moved by the gesture, understanding that Rodriguez was offering him something more valuable than the drinks themselves. The Coca-Cola represented a symbol of the bridge that had been built between former enemies, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended national boundaries and military conflicts. "Thank you, Rodriguez," Otto replied in his much-improved English. "I will not forget this kindness, and I will not forget what you have taught me about America." That evening, Otto shared the precious bottles with Hans Müller and Friedrich Weber, the 3 men sitting outside their barracks, as they had done so many times over the past months, watching another spectacular Georgia sunset. But this time their conversation was different, focused not on criticism of American culture, but on practical questions about how they might apply what they had learned during their captivity to the challenges that awaited them in post-war Germany. "I have been thinking about starting a small business when I return home," Hans admitted, his tone stripped of the intellectual arrogance that had characterized his earlier pronouncements. "Perhaps importing American products, or learning to manufacture similar goods using American methods. There will be demand for consumer luxuries as the economy recovers, and I understand now that such desires are not shallow or unworthy, but represent genuine human needs for pleasure and comfort." Friedrich nodded thoughtfully, taking a slow sip of his Coca-Cola and savoring the taste that had become so familiar over the months of captivity. "I have been corresponding with my former university, and they are interested in hearing about American educational methods and business practices. Perhaps I could teach courses about the principles we have observed here, help German students understand how other societies organize themselves for prosperity and innovation." End quote. Otto listened to his friends with satisfaction, understanding that they had all been changed by their exposure to American culture in ways that went far beyond their appreciation for carbonated soft drinks. They had discovered that strength could emerge from flexibility rather than rigidity, that abundance could be achieved through cooperation rather than domination, and that former enemies could become sources of wisdom rather than objects of hatred. The final weeks at Camp Gordon passed quickly as Otto and his fellow prisoners completed their repatriation processing, underwent medical examinations, and received documentation that would allow them to travel back to Germany. Throughout this period, Otto continued to think about the broader implications of his Coca-Cola experiences, developing what amounted to a personal theory about the relationship between consumer culture and, quote, political freedom. He had come to believe that the ability of a society to produce and distribute luxury goods like Coca-Cola was not just an indicator of economic prosperity, but a reflection of deeper organizational principles that promoted individual initiative, voluntary cooperation, and adaptive problem-solving. The same market mechanisms that ensured consistent quality and wide availability of consumer products also encouraged innovation, rewarded efficiency, and created incentives for peaceful competition, rather than violent conflict. In his final letter from the camp, addressed to his sister, but intended for anyone in his family who might be interested in his observations, Otto attempted to summarize the lessons he had learned about American society and their potential relevance for Germany's future. "The drink called Coca-Cola has taught me more about the sources of American strength than all the military analysis and political propaganda I encountered during the war," he wrote. "It represents a different way of organizing human effort, one that creates abundance rather than scarcity, cooperation rather than conflict, innovation rather than stagnation." He went on to describe his vision of a future Germany that could learn from American examples while retaining its own cultural identity and historical traditions. "We need not become Americans ourselves. he wrote. But we can learn from their methods of organizing society to promote both individual prosperity and collective welfare. The same principles that make it, possible for every American to enjoy a cold Coca-Cola on a hot day also make it possible for their society to achieve remarkable feats of coordination and production." End quote. The letter concluded with a promise that would shape the rest of Otto's life. "When I return to Germany, I will work to help our country learn these lessons and apply them to our own reconstruction efforts. Perhaps someday German companies will produce goods that bring as much pleasure and satisfaction to consumers around the world as Coca-Cola brings to Americans. Perhaps someday we will create a society capable of such abundance that we too can afford to be generous, even to our former enemies." On the morning of his departure from Camp Gordon, Otto packed his few possessions into a small canvas bag provided by the American authorities and prepared for the long journey back to Germany. But before boarding the bus that would take him to the port of embarkation, he made one final visit to the camp canteen, using his last accumulated credits to purchase 2 bottles of Coca-Cola that he planned to save for special occasions during his journey home. As he twisted off the cap of one bottle and took a long drink of the familiar sweet, fizzy liquid, Otto reflected on how profoundly his life had been changed by his encounter with what he had initially dismissed as a child's soda. The Coca-Cola had become far more than just a refreshing beverage. It had become a symbol of everything he had learned about American society, a tangible reminder of the organizational principles and cultural values that had made his captor's victory possible. The bus ride to the port gave Otto time to think about the challenges that awaited him in post-war Germany and how he might begin to implement the ideas that had developed during his months of captivity. He knew that many of his countrymen would be skeptical of anything that seemed to praise American culture or suggest that Germany had something to learn from its former enemies. But he also knew that the evidence of American superiority was overwhelming, demonstrated not just in military victory, but in the casual abundance that allowed prison guards to distribute luxury beverages to captured soldiers. During the ocean voyage back to Europe, Otto shared his theories about Coca-Cola and American organizational principles with other repatriated prisoners, finding that many of them had reached similar conclusions during their own captivity experiences. The ship was crowded with former German soldiers, sailors, and airmen, all carrying their own stories of defeat, imprisonment, and gradual enlightenment about the society that had conquered them. In the cramped quarters below deck, where hundreds of men slept in bunks stacked 3 high, conversations often turned to practical questions about rebuilding their lives in a Germany that had been fundamentally transformed by war and occupation. Otto discovered that his fascination with American consumer culture was shared by many of his fellow passengers, though they expressed it in different ways and with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some had been exposed to American jazz music and found themselves humming melodies that would have been banned as degenerate during the Nazi years. Others talked about American movies they had been shown during their captivity. Films that depicted a society of abundance and opportunity that seemed almost fantastical to men who had grown up during the economic chaos of the Weimar Republic and the rigid controls of the Third Reich. But it was the stories about food and consumer goods that generated the most intense discussions, as former prisoners compared notes about their first encounters with American plenty. Hans Mueller had become something of an expert on American breakfast cereals, describing in loving detail the variety and nutritional content of products that were routinely available to civilian consumers. Friedrich Weber had developed a theory about American automotive culture, arguing that the widespread ownership of private cars reflected organizational principles that could be applied to other sectors of society. And Otto found himself repeatedly returning to the subject of Coca-Cola, using it as a case study to explain broader points about market economics and social organization. "Think about what it takes to make that drink available everywhere," he would say to anyone willing to listen. The coordination between farmers growing sugarcane and coca leaves, the factories producing bottles and caps, the transportation networks moving finished products to retailers, the advertising campaigns creating consumer demand. It's like a vast orchestra playing the same symphony, but instead of one conductor controlling everything, each musician responds to market signals to create harmony. These conversations helped Otto refine his understanding of what he had witnessed during his captivity, but they also made him aware of the challenges he would face in communicating these ideas to Germans who had not shared his experiences. How could he explain the significance of American abundance to people who were still dealing with food shortages and housing destruction? How could he advocate for market-based economic policies to citizens who associated capitalism with the chaos and unemployment of the 1920s and 30s? The ship docked at Hamburg in early December 1945, and Otto got his first glimpse of post-war Germany as he walked down the gangplank carrying his small canvas bag and his carefully hoarded bottle of Coca-Cola. The city was a landscape of rubble and reconstruction, with American and British military vehicles moving through streets lined with damaged buildings. But there were also signs of recovery, new construction projects beginning to rise from the ruins, and shops reopening with goods that Otto recognized as American imports. The repatriation process was efficient but emotionally draining, as Otto submitted to medical examinations, completed extensive paperwork about his prisoner of war experiences, and received temporary documentation that would allow him to travel to his family's current location in Munich. The American officers who processed his case seemed genuinely interested in his welfare, asking questions about his plans for civilian employment and offering information about educational programs available to former prisoners. It was during this processing that Otto had an encounter that would prove crucial to his future career. While waiting in line to receive his travel documents, he struck up a conversation with Captain Robert Mitchell, an American intelligence officer who was conducting interviews with selected repatriated prisoners as part of a study on prisoner of war psychology and rehabilitation. Mitchell was a recent graduate of Harvard Business School who had been assigned to analyze how exposure to American culture during captivity might influence former enemy soldiers' attitudes toward democracy and market economics. When Otto mentioned his interest in Coca-Cola and American business practices, Mitchell's attention was immediately engaged. "Tell me more about that," Mitchell said, pulling Otto aside for a more detailed conversation. "What specifically did you learn about American business methods during your time at Camp Gordon?" Otto found himself explaining his theories about the relationship between consumer culture and organizational efficiency, using Coca-Cola as his primary example of how market competition could produce outcomes that served both individual desires and collective needs. Mitchell listened with growing excitement, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of economic theory and business strategy. "You know," Mitchell said when Otto had finished his explanation, "there are going to be opportunities for Germans who understand American business methods to help with reconstruction efforts. The Marshall Plan is going to provide substantial funding for rebuilding European economies. But success will depend on having local partners who can implement market-based reforms effectively. Have you ever considered a career in international business?" The conversation planted a seed that would grow into Otto's post-war career. But first he needed to reconnect with his family and assess the situation in his homeland. The train journey from Hamburg to Munich took him through a Germany that was both familiar and utterly transformed, with American military bases and supply depots scattered across the landscape like symbols of the new order. In every major town, Otto noticed American products beginning to appear in local shops, including the distinctive bottles of Coca-Cola that had become so important to his understanding of his former captors. His reunion with his family was emotional but complicated, as Otto struggled to explain how his experiences as a prisoner of war had changed his perspectives on politics, economics, and social organization. His sister Maria listened politely to his theories about American business methods, but Otto could see that she was more concerned with practical matters, like finding adequate housing and securing steady employment in a country where traditional industries had been destroyed and social structures had collapsed. His parents were even more skeptical of what they perceived as Otto's enthusiasm for American culture, viewing it as a form of psychological contamination that resulted from his extended captivity. "You sound like you admire the people who destroyed our country," his father said during a particularly tense dinner conversation. "Have you forgotten That these Americans dropped bombs on German cities and killed hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians? Otto struggled to explain that his admiration for American organizational capabilities did not represent approval of every aspect of Allied wartime strategy, but rather recognition of social and economic principles that could help Germany rebuild and prosper in the post-war world. "I'm not saying we should become Americans," he argued. "I'm saying we should learn from their methods of organizing society to promote prosperity and innovation. The same principles that make Coca-Cola successful could be applied to German businesses and industries." And these family discussions were frustrating, but ultimately productive, as they forced Otto to articulate his ideas more clearly and develop strategies for communicating them to audiences who had not shared his prisoner of war experiences. He began to understand that his advocacy for American-style market economics would need to be framed in terms of German interests and values, emphasizing practical benefits rather than abstract principles. The breakthrough came when Otto was offered a position with a small trading company that was beginning to import American consumer goods for distribution in southern Germany. The company's owner, Heinrich Zimmermann, was a former Wehrmacht officer who had been captured by the Americans during the Italian campaign and had developed his own appreciation for American business methods during his Berea captivity. Zimmermann was particularly interested in Otto's knowledge of American consumer preferences and his theories about market-based distribution systems. "I want to bring Coca-Cola to Bavaria," Zimmermann explained during Otto's job interview. "Not just as a novelty item for American soldiers, but as a product that German consumers will learn to appreciate and demand. But I need someone who understands both the product and the principles behind its success. Someone who can help me build distribution networks and marketing strategies that will work in the German context." End quote. The position offered Otto exactly the opportunity he had been hoping for, a chance to apply his theoretical understanding of American business methods to practical challenges of post-war reconstruction. But more than that, it represented an opportunity to participate in the cultural transformation that he believed was necessary for Germany's long-term prosperity and integration into the democratic world order. Otto's first assignment was to conduct market research on German consumer attitudes toward American soft drinks. Traveling throughout Bavaria to interview shopkeepers, restaurant owners, and potential customers about their willingness to try unfamiliar beverages. The work gave him insights into the challenges of introducing foreign products to conservative populations, but it also confirmed his belief that consumer preferences could be influenced through education and marketing. He discovered that initial German reactions to Coca-Cola were remarkably similar to his own first impressions at Camp Gordon, a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and surprise at the intensity of the sweet, carbonated flavor. But he also found that repeat exposure generally led to acceptance and eventually to genuine enthusiasm, particularly among younger consumers who were more open to new experiences and less attached to traditional beverage preferences. The key insight that emerged from Otto's research was that successful marketing of American products in Germany would require more than just making them available in stores. German consumers needed to understand the cultural and social contexts that made these products meaningful in American society. The associations with refreshment, sociability, and modern living that had been built up through decades of advertising and cultural integration. This realization led Otto to develop what would become his signature contribution to German marketing strategy, the concept of cultural translation that involved adapting American promotional techniques to German values and social structures. Instead of simply importing American Coca-Cola advertisements, Otto worked with local artists and copywriters to create marketing campaigns that associated the drink with German concepts of quality, tradition, and community celebration. The strategy proved remarkably successful, as Coca-Cola sales in Bavaria grew steadily throughout 1946 and 1947. But Otto's greatest satisfaction came not from the commercial success itself, but from observing how the introduction of American consumer products was contributing to broader changes in German social attitudes and economic behavior. Young Germans who had grown up under Nazi ideology were discovering that they enjoyed the freedom to choose among competing products, to express individual preferences through consumption decisions, and to participate in a market economy that rewarded innovation and customer service. By 1948, Otto had been promoted to regional marketing director for Zimmermann's company, with responsibility for expanding American product distribution throughout southern Germany. The work brought him into contact with American corporate executives who were beginning to establish European operations as part of the broader effort to rebuild Allied economies and integrate them into a global trading system. It was during one of these business meetings that Otto encountered Robert Mitchell again, now working as a civilian consultant, helping American companies navigate the complexities of European market entry. Mitchell remembered their conversation during Otto's repatriation processing and was eager to learn about his experiences introducing American products to German consumers. "You've become something of a test case," Mitchell explained over dinner at a Munich restaurant where they were served ice-cold Coca-Cola in the familiar curved bottles that had become Otto's symbol of American abundance. "Washington is very interested in understanding how former prisoners of war are adapting to civilian life, and whether exposure to American culture during captivity has long-term effects on political and economic attitudes." Otto found himself once again explaining his theories about the relationship between consumer culture and social organization, but now with the confidence that came from successful practical application of these key ideas. "Coca-Cola was my introduction to American thinking," he said, raising his bottle in a mock toast. "But it's become much more than that. It's become a tool for helping Germans understand that prosperity doesn't have to come through conquest or domination, that abundance can be created through cooperation and competition in peaceful markets." The conversation led to an offer that would transform Otto's career once again, an opportunity to work directly with the American government as a cultural liaison helping to implement Marshall Plan reconstruction programs. The position would involve traveling throughout Europe to advise on strategies for introducing market-based economic reforms and American business practices to societies that had been dominated by centralized planning and authoritarian control. Otto accepted the position with enthusiasm, understanding that it represented a chance to apply his insights about American organizational principles to the broader challenge of European reconstruction. But he also insisted on maintaining his connection to the Coca-Cola business, both for sentimental reasons and because he believed that the soft drink industry provided the clearest example of how market mechanisms could create abundance and prosperity. Over the next several years, Otto traveled extensively throughout occupied Germany and other European countries, working with local business leaders, government officials, and educational institutions to promote understanding of American economic and social models. He became known as an expert on cultural modernization, helping European societies adapt to the consumer capitalism that American policymakers believed was essential for both prosperity and political stability. But wherever he traveled, Otto made sure to include Coca-Cola in his presentations and discussions, using the familiar brown bottles as props to illustrate broader points about market competition, consumer sovereignty, and the organizational principles that made abundance possible. The drink had become his signature metaphor, a tangible symbol of the transformation that he believed was necessary for Europe's integration into the democratic world order. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying, as Otto watched European societies gradually embrace market-based reforms and begin to experience the prosperity that came with competitive economies and consumer choice. By the early 1950s, Coca-Cola was available throughout Western Europe, and Otto took personal pride in knowing that he had played a small but significant role in introducing the product to German consumers. In 1953, Otto received an invitation that represented the culmination of his post-war career, an opportunity to visit the United States as part of a delegation of European business leaders studying American marketing and distribution techniques. The trip would take him to Atlanta, where he would tour the Coca-Cola headquarters and meet with company executives who had developed the global strategies that had made the drink available everywhere from Georgia prison camps to Bavarian restaurants. Standing in the lobby of the Coca-Cola building in Atlanta, surrounded by displays celebrating the company's worldwide expansion and cultural influence. Otto reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from defeated prisoner of war to respected international business consultant. The transformation had begun with a single bottle of fizzy brown liquid handed to him by an American guard who probably never realized the profound impact his gesture would have on a young German corporal's brain. Understanding of the world. But as Otto prepared for his meeting with Coca-Cola's senior executives, he understood that his story was more than just a personal success narrative. It represented something larger about the power of consumer culture to bridge differences between former enemies, to create shared experiences that transcended national boundaries and historical conflicts. The Coca-Cola that had once symbolized American abundance to a captive German soldier had become a global product that connected consumers across continents and cultures. In his final letter to his family before returning to Germany from his American visit, Otto attempted to summarize what he had learned during his remarkable post-war journey. The bottle of Coca-Cola that I first tasted in a Georgia prison camp has taught me more about the sources of prosperity and peace than all the political theories and military strategies I studied during the war. He wrote, "It showed me that abundance creates the possibility for generosity, that prosperity enables societies to treat even their enemies with dignity and respect." The letter concluded with reflections that would guide Otto's work for the rest of his career. "I have learned that the greatest strength of American society is not its military power or its natural resources, but its ability to organize human effort in ways that create abundance rather than scarcity, cooperation rather than conflict. The principles that make it possible for a simple soft drink to be available anywhere in the world are the same principles that can build prosperity and peace among nations that were once grass. Bitter enemies." Otto Becker returned to Germany as one of the most successful advocates for American-style market economics in post-war Europe. But he never forgot the lesson that a fizzy brown drink had taught him about the relationship between consumer culture and social organization. Throughout his career, he kept a bottle of Coca-Cola on his desk, as a reminder of the moment when an enemy guard's simple gesture of kindness had opened his eyes to possibilities he had never imagined. Possibilities that would reshape not just his own life, but the entire trajectory of European economic development in the second half of the 20th century. The 1950s brought new challenges and opportunities as Otto established himself as a leading voice in the emerging field of international marketing and cultural exchange. His expertise in bridging American and European business cultures made him increasingly valuable to multinational corporations seeking to expand their operations across the Atlantic. But it was his work with younger Germans, particularly university students and emerging entrepreneurs, that Otto found most meaningful and that would ultimately have the greatest long-term impact on his country's development. In 1955, Otto was invited to deliver a series of lectures at the University of Munich on the subject of American business methods and European reconstruction. The invitation came from Professor Wilhelm Hartmann, an economist who had spent the war years in Swiss exile and had returned to Germany determined to help rebuild his country's academic institutions along more democratic and internationally oriented lines. Hartmann had heard about Otto's unique background and his successful work introducing American products and business practices to German markets. "I want my students to understand that economic prosperity is not just about natural resources or industrial capacity," Hartmann explained during their initial meeting in his cramped office overlooking the Bonn University's war-damaged courtyard. "It's about organizational principles, cultural attitudes, and the social systems that channel individual effort toward collective benefit. Your experience with Coca-Cola represents something important about how modern economies actually function." Otto's first lecture drew an audience of nearly 200 students, many of them veterans who had returned to their studies after military service and prisoner of war experiences similar to his own. But there were also younger students who had come of age during the final years of the war and the early stages of Reconstruction. Young people who had no personal memory of pre-war Germany and who were therefore more open to new ideas about how their society might be organized. The lecture began with Otto's now familiar story about his first encounter with Coca-Cola at Camp Gordon. But this time, He used the anecdote as a launching point for a broader discussion about the relationship between consumer choice and political freedom. When Sergeant Rodriguez handed me that bottle, Otto told his attentive audience, I thought I was just receiving a strange American drink. But I was actually being introduced to a completely different way of thinking about the relationship between individual desire and social boss. Organization. He went on to explain how market-based economies differed from the centrally planned systems that had dominated Germany during both the Nazi period and the current Soviet occupation of the eastern regions. Instead of having bureaucrats decide what products should be manufactured and distributed, American society allowed consumer preferences to guide production decisions through the mechanism of voluntary exchange. Companies succeeded or failed based on their ability to satisfy customer needs, creating powerful incentives for innovation, efficiency, and responsiveness to changing social conditions. Coca-Cola exists because millions of Americans choose to buy it, Otto explained, pulling out one of the familiar brown bottles that had become his trademark prop. But that choice is only meaningful because there are alternatives. Because consumers can choose Pepsi-Cola, or orange soda, or coffee, or beer instead. Competition forces every company to continuously improve their products and find better ways to serve their customers. And that dynamic process creates the abundance that makes choice possible in the first place. End quote. The students were fascinated by Otto's analysis, particularly his argument that consumer culture was not just about material prosperity, but about the social and political freedoms that made individual choice possible. During the question and answer session that followed his lecture, a young woman named Ingrid Schneider raised her hand to ask about the relationship between American advertising and democratic values. You speak about Coca-Cola as though it represents freedom, Ingrid said. But isn't advertising just another form of propaganda, designed to manipulate people into buying products they don't really need? How is that different from the political propaganda we experienced during the Nazi years? The question was sophisticated and challenging, touching on concerns that Otto had wrestled with during his own journey from prisoner of war to marketing consultant. He paused for a moment before responding, understanding that his answer would reveal something important about his own evolving understanding of the relationship between commerce and democracy. The difference, Otto said finally, is that commercial advertising operates in a competitive marketplace where consumers have real alternatives and genuine choice. Nazi propaganda succeeded because it eliminated alternative sources of information and punished people for expressing dissenting views. But if Coca-Cola's advertising becomes too manipulative or dishonest, consumers can simply choose to buy different products, and the company will lose market share to competitors who serve customer needs more effectively. End quote. He went on to explain that the competitive marketplace created powerful incentives for truth-telling and customer satisfaction that were absent in political systems based on coercion and centralized control. The market is not perfect, Otto acknowledged, but it provides mechanisms for self-correction that authoritarian systems lack. Bad products fail, dishonest companies lose customers, and consumer sovereignty ultimately constrains the power of even the largest corporations. The lecture series proved so popular that Otto was invited to expand it into a regular course on international business and marketing, a position that allowed him to influence a generation of German students who would go on to leadership positions in business, government, and academia. Over the next several years, Otto developed a comprehensive curriculum that used case studies from American consumer goods companies to illustrate broader principles of market economics, democratic grammar, governance, and international cooperation. But it was outside the classroom that Otto's most important work took place, as he mentored individual students who showed particular promise and interest in applying American business methods to German economic development. One of these students was Klaus Weber, the younger brother of Otto's former fellow prisoner Friedrich Weber, who had returned from his own prisoner of war experience with a passion for democratic reform and international cooperation. Klaus had been only 16 when the war ended, too young for military service, but old enough to remember the hardships of the final war years and the chaos of the immediate post-war period. Unlike his older brother, who remained somewhat ambivalent about American culture, despite his intellectual appreciation for its organizational principles. Klaus embraced Otto's teachings with enthusiasm and began developing his own theories about how German businesses could adapt American marketing techniques to European cultural contexts. "I want to create a German company that operates according to American principles," Klaus told Otto during one of their regular coffee meetings at a Munich cafe that had begun serving Coca-Cola alongside traditional German beverages. Not copying American products exactly, but applying their methods of market research, customer service, and competitive innovation to products that reflect German quality and craftsmanship traditions. Otto was impressed by Klaus's synthesis of American business methods with German cultural values. Recognizing in the young man's thinking a maturity and sophistication that reflected the broader evolution of German society during the Reconstruction period. "Tell me more about what you have in mind," Otto encouraged, understanding that Klaus represented the future of German business leadership. Klaus outlined his vision for a company that would manufacture high-quality consumer goods using American production techniques and marketing strategies, but with a focus on the precision engineering and attention to detail that had traditionally characterized German manufacturing. "I think there's an opportunity to combine the best of both approaches," Klaus explained. "American innovation and customer focus with German technical excellence and reliability." The conversation sparked Otto's interest in a new phase of his career, moving beyond his role as a cultural translator and marketing consultant to become an active participant in the creation of German companies that could compete successfully in the emerging global marketplace. Working with Klaus and several other former students, Otto began developing business plans for ventures that would apply the principles he had learned from his Coca-Cola experiences to a wide range of consumer and industrial products. The first of these ventures was a small manufacturing company that produced precision tools for American automotive manufacturers who were beginning to establish operations in Germany as part of the broader trend toward international economic integration. The company's success was built on Klaus's insight that German engineering traditions could be enhanced rather than replaced by American business methods, creating products that combined technical superiority with responsive customer service and flexible production capabilities. But Otto's most ambitious project during this period was his involvement in the establishment of a German bottling plant for Coca-Cola, a venture that represented the full-circle completion of his journey from prisoner of war to international business leader. Working with American corporate executives and German investors, Otto helped design and implement a production and distribution system that would make authentic Coca-Cola available throughout West Germany, while providing employment and business opportunities for German workers and entrepreneurs. The bottling plant opened in 1958, and Otto was invited to participate in the ceremonial first production run that would supply Coca-Cola to retailers throughout Bavaria and beyond. Standing in the modern facility, watching German workers operate American-designed equipment to produce the drink that had transformed his understanding of economic possibility, Otto felt a profound sense of satisfaction and completion. The event was covered extensively by German newspapers and magazines, many of which focused on Otto's remarkable personal story and his role in introducing American business methods to post-war Germany. But Otto understood that his individual success was less important than what it represented about the broader transformation of German society and its integration into the democratic, market-oriented international order that had emerged from the ashes of World War II. In interviews with journalists covering the bottling plant opening, Otto consistently emphasized the symbolic importance of the facility as a demonstration of successful cooperation between former enemies. "This plant represents more than just the production of a popular beverage," he explained to a reporter from Der Spiegel magazine. "It represents the possibility of peaceful economic competition replacing military conflict as the primary mechanism for international interaction." The success of the German Coca-Cola bottling operation led to additional opportunities for Otto to participate in other international business ventures, including consulting work with European companies seeking to enter American markets and advisory roles with American corporations expanding their operations throughout the recovering European economies. By the early 1960s, Otto had become one of the most respected figures in the emerging field of international business development, frequently invited to speak at conferences and universities throughout Europe and North America. But despite his professional success and international recognition, Otto remained committed to his teaching responsibilities at the University of Munich. Understanding that his most important contribution to Germany's future lay in educating the next generation of business and political leaders, his courses on international marketing and economic development became required components of the university's business curriculum, and his former students began to occupy influential positions throughout German society. One of Otto's proudest achievements during this period was the establishment of an exchange program that brought American business students to study in Germany, while sending German students to complete POWs internships with American corporations. The program was designed to create a new generation of business leaders who understood both American and European approaches to market economics and who could serve as bridges between the two societies as economic integration deepened. The exchange program's success attracted attention from government officials and academic leaders on both sides of the Atlantic, leading to Otto's appointment as a special advisor to the German Ministry of Economic Affairs on matters related to transatlantic trade and investment. The position provided him with a platform to influence policy decisions that would shape Germany's economic development for decades to come. Always guided by the insights he had gained from his transformative encounter with American abundance in a Georgia prison camp, as Otto entered his 60s, he began to reflect more deeply on the broader historical significance of his experiences and their implications for understanding the relationship between economic systems and international peace. He had witnessed firsthand the transformation of Germany from a defeated, authoritarian society to a prosperous, democratic member of the international community. And he believed that the principles he had learned from studying American consumer culture had played a crucial role in that transformation. In 1968, Otto was invited to deliver the keynote address at an international conference on economic development and democratic values, held at Harvard University, the same institution where Robert Mitchell had studied before their fateful meeting during Otto's repatriation processing. The invitation represented a culmination of Otto's career and an opportunity to share his insights with a global audience of scholars, policymakers, and business leaders. Standing at the podium in Harvard's historic Sanders Theater, Otto began his address with the same story that had launched his post-war career. The tale of a young German prisoner of war who had discovered the power of American organizational principles through his encounter with a fizzy brown drink. But this time, he used the anecdote to explore broader questions about the relationship between economic freedom and international cooperation in an increasingly interconnected world. The bottle of Coca-Cola that changed my life represents something profound about the possibilities for peaceful coexistence among nations with different histories and cultural traditions, Otto told his distinguished audience. It demonstrates that abundance can be created through voluntary cooperation rather than coercive domination, that prosperity can be achieved through competitive innovation rather than military conquest. The address was received with enthusiastic applause and led to extensive discussions about the role of consumer culture in promoting democratic values and international understanding. Otto's insights about the relationship between market economics and political freedom resonated with an audience that was grappling with the challenges of economic development, Cold War tensions, and the emerging process of European integration. Following his Harvard address, Otto returned to Germany with a renewed sense of purpose and a commitment to documenting his experiences for future generations of students and policymakers. He began work on a memoir that would tell the complete story of his transformation from defeated prisoner of war to successful international business consultant, using his personal journey to illustrate broader themes about economic development, cultural exchange, and the possibilities for peaceful cooperation among former enemies. The memoir, titled From Prison Camp to Prosperity: Lessons in American Business from a German Prisoner of War, was published in 1970 and became an influential text in business schools and policy institutes throughout Europe and North America. But Otto's proudest achievement was not the book's commercial success or critical acclaim. but rather the letters he received from readers who had been inspired by his story to pursue their own careers in international business and cultural exchange. Otto Becker passed away in 1985 at the age of 62, leaving behind a legacy that extended far beyond his individual accomplishments to encompass the broader transformation of German society and its integration into the democratic international order. His funeral was attended by hundreds of former students, business colleagues, and government officials, all of whom had been influenced by his teachings about the relationship between economic freedom and social prosperity. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Otto's memory was the decision by his former students to establish a scholarship fund that would support international exchange programs between German and American universities, ensuring that future generations of students would have the opportunity to learn from each other's societies and cultures. The scholarship was funded in part by donations from the Coca-Cola company, which had grown to become one of the world's largest multinational corporations, while never forgetting its role in Otto Becker's remarkable journey from prisoner of war to international business leader.